what's your question today?
Yes. So my question to you is, I heard this statement that goes something like, the desire to be loved is the last illusion. What are your thoughts on that?
The desire to be loved is the last illusion. Ooh. That's kind of heavy, in a sense. That's interesting. I like that quote a lot. Never heard it, by the way, until you mentioned it. So it's a very interesting expression, and I would associate it with a lot of the Eastern philosophies that talk about enlightenment or self-realization type philosophies, right? Where we're supposed to like transcend a certain level of being or way of being in the world. Like even Buddhism per se has this notion as well of enlightenment, right? Hinduism as well. There's this talk of enlightenment. And usually that's tied to an interesting and controversial notion of unattachment or detachment. Now, that is a big can of worms that I think should be explored and clarified. In other words, there's a lot of misunderstandings, I think, with respect to this notion of unattachment. And so I'm glad you're asking this question, because it's pretty profound and can be useful in a very practical way. But I remember struggling with this very notion of unattachment or detachment. There's different ways to describe it. And when I was younger and getting in the spiritual path, I was in my early 20s reading all kinds of books on yoga, philosophy, meditation, and Buddhism and Hinduism. I found like those philosophies more interesting in terms of answering my existential questions and problems in life, right? So one thing that I ended up doing is misapplying this notion of detachment so that it was harmful for me, right? Let me explain. Perhaps I'm being a little long with this, so let me give the quick answer. The notion of this desire to be loved being the last illusion comes down to attachment, because it's about desire, right? So the key word in this phrase is the desire to, period. So in Buddhism, for instance, is the clearest way that, or the clearest statement for why detachment is such a big buzzword, right? Unattachment, because the Buddha said is that his goal in life, by the way, was to solve for humanity once and for all the problem of suffering. So he said, right, we're all suffering and so forth. I'm going to presume that you know the story of the Buddha a little bit. So he's focused on the problem, suffering, and he says, hey, I discovered it. He becomes enlightened, and he says, I have the solution. And the solution, he says, is to go to the root of our suffering. What's causing the suffering? And he says, the suffering is not what's happening to us on the outside, or even to the body, right? Like sickness, or somebody broke up with me, or lied to me. The world is this way and that way. He says, that's not the suffering. The suffering is that you have a desire for things to be a certain way. So the root of our suffering is actually our own state of being and mind, that we have an attachment, i.e. a desire for certain things, and then we suffer. So if you remove the desire, there's no suffering, and you're enlightened. Then you go through life without suffering. And of course he didn't mean like if you hit your hand or get a cut, you don't go ow. The suffering he's talking about, which he calls dukkha, which is translated more accurately to like dissatisfaction, being dissatisfied. So it's not that you won't have any like misfortunes or like physical pain. You can go ow if somebody hits you, but it's the additional like, why would they hit me, and why am I in pain, and that dialogue that then we judge it as bad, right? So then that's an attachment to the idea I shouldn't be suffering physically, and this person should not have hit me. So I'm attached to the idea that you should be nice to me, and that's what's making me suffer, right? So the root of that quote, I would say, is to get to that issue of desire. We have desire, and this is the cause of our suffering, the root of our suffering. So then there's this whole movement of like, okay, so be unattached. So when I read that, I was like, okay, great, I'm gonna be unattached, and I want to meditate and try to transcend and be like the Buddha and have no desires. I took that literally. So I was like, I'm trying to be ascetic. I fasted sometimes, didn't eat for a couple of days, tried to meditate and have no desires, any kind of desires for food or otherwise, and just like go inward and just detach from the physical world altogether. Now, is that healthy? Right? That could go wrong. And I think it did. Like I started to become indifferent in my life, not taking care of certain responsibilities, right? Not taking care of my food situation or my clothes or money or whatever, right? Not caring about relationships and other people. So I became so detached or unattached that I stopped caring for people even, right? I started noticing like, oh wow, I'm becoming like numb to the world. But is that the goal, right? So we have to be careful how we understand these concepts. And I think in spirituality, especially like New Age type of movement, sometimes that could be dangerous. They misapply certain traditional Hindu concepts sometimes, or Buddhist concepts, in ways that are unhealthy actually, because they're misunderstanding it. And this again is why philosophy is so useful, because the role of philosophy or philosophers, often the entire focus is, what do we mean by words, enlightenment? What are you talking about? Explain it, right? We don't just assume it. We all always want to understand precisely, well, what do you mean? But oftentimes in religion and pop culture, we want to just take these buzzwords and concepts and apply them very responsibly with no one really knowing what things mean, and then that's how people harm themselves and take certain bad actions or bad habits, right? So then I went deeper in terms of that story into exploring the concept of unattachment, and I realized that it's not becoming indifferent. In fact, that's the wrong way to go about it, right? And most Buddhists actually tell you, no, you need to be loving and kind to others, right? You actually have to stay engaged in some level in the world and so forth. Because notice, there's a lot of hidden ways to be attached. And that's why Buddhism, someone said once, Buddhism, to truly understand it, you have to have like a master's level understanding. Like you have to actually study it deeply. Here's why. The very notion of being unattached could be tricky, because there's many ways that your mind can attach that you're not even aware of. For example, attaching to a certain idea. There's a famous saying that the Buddha either didn't talk about God or the self, right? Didn't directly deny it, but this famous that he didn't really address it or want to talk about God and the self or the soul. And the reason is because if you take this notion of, well, attachment is the problem, then you can attach to an idea that makes you suffer. So he's like, you get rid of it then. Right? So if you have a certain concept of God and it's causing you to suffer every minute of the day, he's like, why are you having that idea? Now notice he's not denying that God exists. If God exists, he can be, fully real and be the foundation of reality and all of that. But are concepts correct about God? We don't know, perhaps, right? Or for the Buddha, since his goal is to get rid of suffering, then he's like, well, if it's making you suffer, why are you going to hold on to that, right? So the point is, any idea, including your concepts of yourself or your concepts of God, right? If you think of yourself as a soul, should be immortal, or whatever concepts you're tied to it, the Buddha's like, well, if it's making you suffer and making you act in a certain way that's not good for you, then get rid of it. So that's why the Buddhists talk about kind of like nothingness and the idea of enlightenment and nirvana is tied to the notion, which is not a notion, kind of, it's a reality in a sense that you're trying to access. It's like you want to reach this nothingness because it's another word for being unattached.
Yeah, we can love other people in their purest form only when we love ourselves first. But a lot of times people have problem with loving themselves truly. They have a hard time accepting themselves and love.
Okay, I see. Yeah. That is a common theme, and I think it's true to a great degree. This notion of that you can't really love others properly or purely, like you put it, unless you love yourself. This is true. So then the question of how do we love ourselves is the issue, right? So it can be a tricky thing. Some changing of the concepts can help, but one of the ways I've thought of it that's been helpful is kind of like, well, what does love usually do, whether for others or yourself? And one of the main aspects of love is a kind of total acceptance. When someone loves someone completely, like a mother, I like as a primary example, right? Is like the child can't do wrong. So it's a total acceptance. So if you turn that to yourself, it's like learning to accept every part of yourself as you are, right? And starting from there. Doesn't mean that you can't try to improve yourself or whatever, but you have to start with accepting yourself without judgment, right? So that's one starting point that I would say, in terms of a practical way to think about like how to love yourself. But another thing I would say to that is that I've thought of like two different aspects of this question, in the sense of like what prevents, let's say, us loving ourselves. And so those are two things. In a sense, negative programming from our experiences, childhood, upbringings and experiences in the world, right? So it's like our mind turning against us, recording, let's say, certain bad thoughts from the external world about ourselves. So that's one aspect, how we sort of end up using our minds against ourselves. And so the way that we can solve that issue is then do the opposite, right? Like undo that. So if you're aware of like all the negative programming, like that's why people do mantras or like positive affirmations, right? To reprogram the negative thinking mind, right? So that's one approach, kind of directly attack or tackle the issue of like negative thinking and change it to positive thinking about yourself, right? But there's an indirect route. It's like an indirect route in the sense that you might say, well, if like I remember a guru said something like, what are you talking about? Self-love. You can't self-love yourself because then you're splitting yourself into two. I think it was Sadhguru that said something like that. It's this self-love talk. This makes no sense because like for you to love yourself, you have to, who's loving who? Right? It's like, I'm gonna love myself over here. No, you are that. So then from that perspective, it's kind of like, well, yeah, what is this self-love thing? And so one way to look at it is that some traditions, they might say, and I'm sympathetic to this view, of like, well, what's the ultimate nature of the self and of the ultimate reality, right? Like, what do we come from, right? So if you assume that at our deepest level we are good, then what's preventing our sort of feeling good, which is really what we mean by self-love in a sense, having a sort of positive feeling about yourself, so to speak, then what's preventing it is just thoughts. And so you have to learn to kind of get rid of those thoughts, period, and get into the experience of your inner self. That's before all of those negative programmings. And that's closer to that notion that I said before, like how do you be love, so to speak, or become love, is by going underneath the thoughts that make you non-loving. Right? Because deep down, like, we might be good, actually. Some traditions, spiritual traditions, think along those lines. Right? Yeah, so it's kind of like learning to remove the interferences from like our deeper nature, which is actually good. At least some people think that. I leave it to you to figure out whether that's true or not. But I do believe in going within ourselves to find the truth.